Welcome to the Catholic Theology Show, sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle, a community that supports the mission of Ave Maria University through their monthly donations of $10 or more. If you'd like to support this podcast and the mission of Ave Maria, please go to avemaria.edu/donate for more information. I'm your host, Michael Dauphinais, and today I am happy to be joined by Professor Joseph Capizzi, who is the Dean and Ordinary Professor of Moral Theology and Ethics at the Catholic University of America. Thanks for being on the show.
My pleasure, Michael. Good to see you.
Well, glad to have you here. And you've written and spoken a lot about the just war theory.
Correct.
Right. And you'll be actually speaking at Ave Maria, hosted by the Thomistic Institute here, and as part of your visit to Ave Maria. And, you know, when we just think a little bit about this idea of just war, to kind of just start with like just a big kind of question, I think so many people today have just kind of like an instinctive idea that somehow, you know, Christianity has a unhappy relationship with business, and Christianity has an unhappy relationship with war, and that, you know, Christianity kind of leans in a kind of pacifist direction, that war is just, you know, that we just shouldn't do it, you know,
Sure.
And so how do you begin when you're teaching and speaking on just war? How do you try to help people like maybe respect that, because there's some
Sure.
truth
Yep.
to those aspects, but also how is that that's kind of a narrow way of thinking about the Christian tradition?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think when you begin by thinking in terms of war as a problem, to some extent you're already leaning in a pacifist direction, and a direction away from understanding that government exists for certain purposes, and government is a good, right? Government, in fact, is a gift of God to human beings who are the sorts of beings without government, you know, kind of run amok. Yeah. So because it's a gift, because it is a good, there are certain things that government does that we have to recognize as good for human beings. Those include guiding human beings towards ends that are good for them as opposed to ends that are bad for them. And if you know human beings well, and it doesn't take a lot to, you know, learn a little bit about human beings, you know that they often resist being guided in particular directions, and you have to use force to move them towards good things and away from bad things. Sometimes that force can be expressed in terms of inducements, right? Like, look, I'll give you something if you'll do, you know, this or that. And we do this with our own children when you're raising children, right? Here's $40, clean out the garage, right? Or if you study hard this weekend, you know, we'll take you to ice cream at the end of the weekend or something like, right? That. Yeah. We don't think of that typically as a kind of exercise of authority, but it is. And other times, the authority gets exercised in a more, let's say, negative way, right? It's not an inducement, but more of a kind of pushing towards or away from something with the use of something that we typically think of as force. And I mean, long story short, the use of force by governments, often against people who are doing really bad things, we kind of all intuitively would accept. We understand that the police have to do things to protect us from malefactors, that laws exist to, to persuade people not to do things they might otherwise do. And we saw during the pandemic what happens when you stop enforcing those kinds of laws. People aren't, you can see how often I'm appealing to like sort of how we understand human beings, right? Yeah. People without law, they'll do nasty things to each other. And the idea with regard to war is that you apply that same kind of thinking about the use of law and the use of force, not simply to what is often called like a domestic situation, right? Internal to a state, but in terms of relationships between states. And there are bad actors, either that are non-state actors like terrorist groups or state actors sometimes, right? That will act in a manner that has to be responded to in terms of force, the government's obligation to protect the common good of a particular community. Relatedly, especially, from the perspective of Scripture, is just the question of killing itself, right? And that's the point at which there's a long tradition of our way of thinking that makes distinctions between the sorts of killing that human beings should never, ever do and the sorts of killing that they should, in certain very defined circumstances, do in defense of certain kinds of goods. Everybody recognizes war is always a certain kind of failure. The popes have been, said this repeatedly. It's a certain human experience that we just can't get rid of because of our nature and the nature of the world that we live in. So it's always a sort of defeat. This is the language, the popes in the middle of the 20th century began to use, and how could they not, given those circumstances? And of course, the popes since then have continued to use. But nonetheless, sometimes it's the best alternative given a certain set of circumstances, because some great good, including the lives of innocent people, is being threatened by some evil actor. And it's appropriate for Christians even to step in there and respond. So there you go. There's a long answer to start us off, Mike.
No, that's great. And I think it's very helpful because what you do is you situate there an ethical question within a broader view of the whole.
That's right.
And then also that the grace does not destroy nature, but perfects nature.
Right.
And so if some level of, protection of food, protection of life is appropriate at the natural level, a mother and a father are there to protect the child.
Right.
And that there are these elements of protection and that these are, necessary, that then it's appropriate that some level of defense in this world is exercised. And at the same time, there's also a recognition that it's not going to be kind of complete or clean.
That's right.
That we have a recognition that it's going to be somehow imperfect. And so maybe I'd like to just kind of talk a little bit about those ideas. But before we talk about the imperfection of these elements, which I think is really important, I'd like you to talk about what is the idea. So this just war. Yeah. So we know one thing is it doesn't mean it's a perfect war.
Correct.
That's the first idea, which is probably pretty important.
Which is very important.
Yeah.
That's right.
Because I do think some people expect that we ought to be able to find a way to navigate war in a way where we would be guiltless.
That's right. That's right.
And it seems to me war is inevitably going to be messy, but that we kind of don't have a choice at times. But so where did this language come from of the just war within the tradition? And maybe if you could talk a little bit about like Augustine and Aquinas and what were their particular contributions?
Yeah. Well, so the language of just war is actually Roman, right? It comes out of the Roman tradition, and the Latin for it, justum bellum, right, is a common term that was used by Romans. I'm sure it predates that even, right? There's just a sense to distinguish this kind of activity from other kinds of activity that are evil. And Augustine and the tradition picks up that same language and carries it forward. And part of what's going on there, and this is where the language is a little bit deceiving, is the language of jus, right, and as we both know from studying Latin, is very close to the language of justice in general and also of right. And part of what the ambiguity for us English speakers is when we hear the term just, we think, oh, it must be just, like in a kind of whole sense in the way you describe it, kind of complete cleanness. And the pacifistic modern sort of engagement with this tradition has really pushed just war thinking into that corner and said, oh, you're suggesting all of this is clean and perfect, when we can point out even in the most stark situations like Nazi Germany, where it seems like you have a just cause and you have the right authority of the Poles and of the French and of the English and ultimately of the Americans making a good judgment about how unjust the Germans are, we can still find instances of illegal military activity, bombing of cities by the Allied forces, of murder within the context of war, and so on. And therefore, isn't this all unjust? That's born of this ambiguity. That's not what the account means. What it means instead is that this sort of like entire like pool of activity that you're about to engage in has met the criteria that distinguish it from other kinds of things, but within which law and morality still has to abound. And because we're all broken human beings and we're all imperfect, there will still be, violations of that. But the pacifistic approach is pushed the account into this corner where you sometimes find people trying to defend it by not recognizing that's not the expectation here. The world is fallen, right? And even within a fallen world, we can make distinctions about this is more just than that is, or this is less unjust than that is. And because it's less unjust, because it's closer to what we believe is true and just and good for human beings, it's worth defending and trying to push it towards even greater justice. So that's part of, I think, what's happening there. Yeah. I mean, I don't
so
know
that's great. I think that's very helpful. So then, at least within the Greco-Roman context, in the Roman context, then it would mean kind of a just war was at least recognized as somehow like defensible.
Yes.
Within an accepted notion of justice, which is to give to each their due, to give to those who are good, good, and those who are bad, bad.
That's right.
And so a bad agent gets a bad, is ought to be treated badly.
Correct.
In order to...
or ought to be treated, not badly, ought to be treated in the way he deserves.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
I mean,
that's a nice way of putting it. Yes.
Right.
So therefore... so that's just a general idea. And so then Augustine, how does Augustine then take this idea from Rome? Because Augustine's quite critical of Rome in many ways in the city of God, and contrasts the city of man, the Rome seeking, earthly glory versus the city of God, the church seeking heavenly, eternal glory. So how does Augustine, take both, how is he both a critic of Rome, but then also taking up the Roman category of just war?
Yeah. So what we're both seeing is, as you try to talk about just war, which is this funky category that I think all of us kind of think we understand, you can't help but talking about deep background theological and political issues. And that's partly what I always try to do is say, look, the just war account really is an account of politics and moral theology, right? I mean, it's a combination of these two things. And that's what you see in Augustine. So the City of God is to some extent, a book. I mean, you can argue about this with different people, but it's a book about politics, right? That there's a lot of political analysis going on where Augustine does precisely what you said, which is how do you understand empire, right, and city in a context where we Christians also understand that we have a new king, right, and a king who has inaugurated a new empire, right? And now we are citizens in a kind of mysterious way of this new empire, while also remaining Roman citizens. And you can see Augustine's proud to be a Roman, right? I mean, even though he criticizes it, he also recognizes that at one point it was quite glorious, right? There was a lot of quasi-virtue among the Romans where they sacrificed. They weren't interested in greed, right? They were interested instead in glory, and there's something noble about that. So he can't help himself by sort of exploring Rome very closely in the context of the empire he thinks that Christ has given us, the kingdom that we now occupy as Christian citizens. And by comparison to that, of course, it's infinitely fallen, right? It's infinitely worse. But from the perspective of humanity, where we actually occupy right now, and which is important to us, and you have all the other scripture, which is, saying things to us like, make the peace of that city your peace, right? Augustine says this, we Christians depend upon the little peace that we now experience in the world. We have a stake in the peace of the city we occupy, Rome, Washington, D.C., Paris, whatever. So that stake in it becomes the animating principle by which we recognize that's a good, right? It's a good thing that there's stability rather than an instability. And that little stability is a kind of peace, right? This is the language that Augustine uses here, is like the order that we preserve, that we live in, does provide a kind of peacefulness that is necessary for human flourishing. And we know that, right? We know that already. You can look in different parts of the world right now and see great disorder is not good for people. And because disorder is good for people, people should defend it. When it is attacked by people who are not interested in order, they're interested in disorder, or they're interested in imposing their right on, another right, their right being wrong, and so on. So it's a really careful analysis, while he also is saying over and over, and these passages where Augustine describes war in horrific terms. War is awful. He understands that. But worse is disorder. Mm-hmm. Right. And there are times this is why you have to be very careful about what you justify in terms of, the language here is there are times when the disorder of war is worse than the alternative. I mean, it's better, than the alternative, right, of the disorder of a city that's collapsing or attacked or whatever.
Yeah. And maybe a way of putting that then is that Augustine, is always emphasizing the priority of the kingdom of God.
Absolutely.
And that the peace that we need, the peace that we seek is not the Pax Romana, it's not the peace of the world, it's the peace that's really only made possible through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ and his resurrected person that includes within it himself and his body.
That's right.
The church. And that's what we need. And so in that sense, he's going to show how the city of Rome and the peace of Rome is inadequate and incomplete, and the justice of Rome is inadequate and incomplete.
Yes.
The justice and peace of any earthly city is inadequate and incomplete compared to that which we need, which is the city offered by Jesus Christ.
Right.
And at the same time, the earthly city still has a reality. It still has a reality and something that can be more or less.
That's right.
Just. It's not going to be just fully. No earthly city is going to be, but it's better to have, right, a city where you can not be robbed frequently.
That's right.
It's better to have a city that is not constantly being robbed internally or externally. Mm-hmm. It's not going to be perfect, but it's better to have a better one. And therefore, we have an interest in defending. And within that really becomes the context then for determining what a just war is.
That's right. And just related to that point, too, is in a sense, the Christian understands better than the non-Christian the usefulness of the peace that God provides even in a broken world. Mm-hmm. And so because he understands that better, he's able on the one hand to defend it when necessary, but also to recognize states and cities or empires, they're mortal.
Yeah.
They come and they go. And there may be some time when you have to let go and recognize that, again, my peace is not here. My ultimate peace is somewhere else. And I won't, for instance, sacrifice my soul for the sake of the state. Even while I might sacrifice my mortal life for it, I won't sacrifice my soul. So like any good person who engages this kind of account, Augustine's going to say, well, you can't do immoral things in the course of doing this. You can't even harbor intentions of hate. As you do this, right? Which is a famous passage of his. And look, it's a challenging one. Can you fight an enemy to the point of death that you don't hate? And Augustine, with the tradition that develops out of him, is claiming, yes, you can. In fact, you have to, right? You have to recognize this as an activity of love. Again, much as a parent, right, who might have to punish a child, right, and cause herself or himself pain in the doing of this. The classic, this is going to hurt you more than it hurts me, which to some extent we kind of mock, but there's something true about that often, right? When you recognize you're going to force a child to, not to be with their friends and to lose a good that they want because for their own sake of development and so on. The Christian understands that peace better than the pagan does, than the non-Christian does.
Yeah. And one of the things Augustine says in the City of God that I always remember as well that helps me understand him is this idea that basically that the peace and the virtue we have is always mediated through the redemption of Christ. And so in a certain sense, we possess it by through our repentance and forgiveness. It's when we eschew and we admit our pridefulness. We admit how hateful we are.
That's right.
We admit how envious we are. Then in a way, God's gift of mercy becomes more received by us. And so therefore it's still there again, where it's not a sense in which we're going to get it right completely.
Correct. That's right.
And we wouldn't still need forgiveness of sins.
That
becomes his argument against the Pelagians. Now, before we go a little bit more into how Augustine and Aquinas and also we would talk a little bit more about going all the way up to today.
Yeah, sure.
I do want to for just members of our audience who, just a chance to get to know you a little bit better, how did you get interested in, your faith? How did you get interested in being a theologian, a moral theologian, and then kind of dedicating your life to questions about war and, war and this great faith that we have?
Yeah, great question. And I'm sure to some extent, it's the sort of question as you answer it, you're kind of doing a psychoanalysis. A lot of different factors. Number one, I was always interested in questions and, sort of the deeper questions, like about purpose, about evil, the kind of classic, almost like Augustine and the Confessions, right? The same kind of concerns animated me at a very young age. And like every young man, of our generation, I read Nietzsche, which is kind of funny thing, for a Catholic theologian to say was an instrumental point or a step in his progress. But reading Nietzsche, actually, I thought was very helpful. I thought it was really clarifying in terms of the world we occupy right now. I mean, I think he's a mad genius, like really brilliant analyst of where we are. And a lot of what he says is, it's not quite true, but it's diagnostically very helpful to figure out like what many of our peers are sort of swimming in. And anyway, so this was that was high school. Undergrad at UVA, I studied philosophy and religious studies, and one of my professors was a wonderful man named Carlos Ayer, who's now at Yale. At the time, he was at the University of Virginia, and I took history of Christianity with him and became increasingly interested in the Christian response to these things. I'd been an altar boy all my life, but like a typical, C.S. Lewis kind of story, alienated a little bit from things, and started to get back through reading and studying with Carlos, even though I didn't really have many conversations with him about this. And then went to Emory University, a Protestant, a Methodist institution for my master's degree. And it was there that it really kind of accelerated my return to Catholicism. I sometimes people ask, how'd you become a moral theologian? It's like, look, I just kept pursuing certain kinds of questions and people kept paying me to study them. Right. So like, great. Emory gave me a really nice package to go there and study. I went to Notre Dame and study, but by the time I was at Notre Dame, I was fully back, with the church and so on. And the kinds of questions that I'm interested in all pivot around fundamental theological issues, one of which is, for instance, authority. Like I'm really interested in questions of authority and agency. And war is a great place where obvious authority questions arise. There are the authority within the hierarchy of the military and so on, but there's also just the authorization. Like to me, when I look at the categories of just war theory, some of which I named already, right? The kind of, right authority, right cause, last resort, proportionality, and so on. Those are just categories of moral thinking, right? I mean, we forget this a lot of times, but whenever I do anything, it's me as the authority making a judgment. This is the right thing to do. The circumstances require this, acting proportionally. Am I violating a moral law? They're all the same programmatically. So authority and agency have been things I've studied for a long time. And like a typical young man, who's not interested in history of war. And I was puzzled by these same kinds of questions about how can a Christian justify killing at all? Because it does seem like there's a lot in the New Testament that would suggest there's a problem with that. And the more I studied, the more I realized, well, that problem has been dealt with by our tradition really well by making good distinctions about action and agency. And, I was kind of off and running at that point and just kept writing about it and thinking about it.
That's a great story. And it's I love the way that you describe this kind of deepening encounter with the faith as the answer to questions. And Nietzsche, not as one you follow as a master, but as the one who does diagnose our age, right? He says, we are weary of man. We no longer want to live. And we've kind of lost the will to live. Now, he, of course, thinks we need to recover the will to live by recovering the will to power.
That's right.
Which is a kind of a sophomoric answer. It's not the deep answer.
Right.
But we do need to discover the will to live. I think Viktor Frankl responded to that very beautifully through the will to meaning, man's search for meaning, which is we need the will to live has to be found in the will to meaning, that we can discover meaning in the world through our own response to the world.
That's correct.
Right.
Which is agency again, which is our action, which I think, I mean, this is, if I ever get the time, being a dean, you have less time.
Yes.
Well, that's the project I want to work on is agency, because I think our age, and you know this again, you can see how we are not merely redefining agency, we're really constricting the space within we can act as agents or understand ourselves and act as agents, which is, this is a partly, again, Nietzsche's diagnosis is like we're creating the conditions where no man can live. Yeah. Right. And we see this quite literally where people aren't having children, where, we're concerned about technology taking over agency and so on. Right. And also people not having meaning and, increased recourse to suicide and, euthanasia and so on. And it's all very reasonable, right? I mean, this is what's scary about it, is that it's all very reasonable reaction to the circumstances in which we find ourselves. And again, I think Nietzsche kind of described that. And of course, it was over 100 and, however many years ago that he did this. And we seem to be accelerating into a lot of, probably what he himself wouldn't have seen in detail, but had a sense was already, the foundations were already present. Yeah, there was a part of the introduction to Vatican I, De Filius, which is on the Son of God, and basically on the idea that revelation is real, revelation is noble. We can come to know the existence of God through reason alone, and we can also come to know the existence of God and his plans through revelation. And it says there in the beginning that if we begin to deny that God can reveal himself and that we can know about the world and about God, we will actually fall into this kind of dissolution of humanity. And Vatican II picked that up, and Gaudium et Spes, right? Without the creator, the creature vanishes, and Benedict. And so, that idea that we really need to recover a sense of the whole. And so a lot of the problems with war and just war they're not so much the technical issues. They're a sense of a loss of this recovery of the whole order. That's correct. And this idea that we can actually, the whole order is ultimately going to be God. Right. And God, as one of the Augustinians would say, right, God loving him, Carl Adam, I think, wrote this, God loving himself in Christ in the end, right, with all of us as part of his body. But that the reality of that order does not get rid of the reality of this current order that participates in it. That's right. And so, and I'd love to talk about this when we get back from our break, is it seems to me so many people are haunted. If they're not Nietzsche, they're Nietzschean because they've given up hope, because they are haunted by this myth of the perfectibility of humanity, the perfectibility of human society, and because they believe that we are perfectible, then they will not tolerate imperfection any longer. So I'd love if you'd be willing to, say a little bit about that when we get back from the break. Absolutely. That's a tough one, but sure. Yes. Thank you. Of course.
You're listening to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University and sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle. Through their generous donations of $10 or more per month, Annunciation Circle members directly support the mission of AMU to be a fountainhead of renewal for the Church through our faculty, staff, students, and alumni. To learn more, visit avemaria.edu/join. Thank you for your continued support. And now, let's get back to the show.
And we've been discussing just war within the tradition and kind of the way in which just war fits within a whole vision of what it means to be human, a whole vision of who God is, right? In the proper role of families and states, even if families and states are imperfect, that in this order they still have a kind of perfection, or a kind of, not a perfect, they still have a reality. Yeah. They bring us to a certain good that we could not achieve on our own, and therefore can use force to somehow defend those common goods that they inhabit. Now, we were talking a little bit as well about how that this relates to kind of a vision is life still good?
Yeah.
Right? Because in the Nietzschean question is that no, life is no longer good. We're weary of life. We no longer want to live. And I think sometimes we have that question, right? We talk about choose life, right? Well, the question is, have you consented? Have you offered your consent to the world as it is today and your life within it?
Right.
And in a lot of ways, actually, I think that in its full sense is almost like the yes of baptism.
That's right.
I believe in God and all of this order, including not only all of the problems, but also the solution that God has instantiated in Jesus Christ. So within this, I was kind of trying to think about some of the different questions with preparing this talk and listening to some talks on just war. And it seems that so much we're haunted by this ideal of the perfectibility. And I was thinking that in many ways, the gospel is really the gospel of the imperfectibility of man, family, and society.
Right.
And Benedict XVI says specifically in his encyclical Spe Salvi, by hope we are saved, whereas we're saved by hope, which means we're not saved now.
That's right.
And he says we need to be very cautious of scientific or political regimes or projects that claim perfection, because they'll end up doing untold damage.
Right.
And so this is not very much fun to say, hey, we're fundamentally imperfectible. So I'm not going to fundamentally raise my children any better than my parents raised me. It's going to be really hard to break the cycle of sin.
Sure.
And that whatever city we set up will not actually eradicate crime or injustice or sexism or racism. We're going to have to tolerate a fair amount of imperfection. But it seems that's really necessary for us to actually kind of somehow at least accept this order of divine providence as a temporary home for us to live and to somehow find God here.
That's right.
So what would you say, how does that that sense of the imperfectibility of this current order, how does it relate to just war and somehow help us to understand why we still ought to try to find a kind of justness in war, even if war will still not be perfect or clean?
Yeah. And I think the better way to maybe put that is how do you find how do you attach yourself to the relative imperfect situation you find yourselves in as a Christian? And we have good examples for that. And first, I think it's important to affirm what you said, which is that perfection and perfectionism is dangerous. It's probably, in fact, sinful, right? The notion that we as human beings can bring about a perfect society or even a perfect human being is a temptation, right? Yeah. It's a temptation to be resisted. And we're taught this over and over in Scripture. We're taught this over and over in experience. A lot of the dangerous ideologies of modernity have been perfectionist ideologies. Communism promised, the perfection of a classless society that would bring into being the new man. And in order to do that, it literally engaged itself in the destruction of tens of millions of human beings, right? And whether that was in Cambodia or Russia or in Cuba or, wherever you want to look for it, it was a ideology about perfection. And we have liberal versions of that in our own culture, and this is partly what Benedict is warning us about as well. And the popes in the encyclical tradition of Catholic social teaching always caution about the new forms of slavery that emerge from technological progress. Now, progress is not bad and technology is not bad, but it can be. And it can be enslaving. And this is what they're warning us about. And you can see this today, that we all are aware that we're on the cusp of redefining the human in terms of technological advancement. So those are things that as Christians we should be really concerned about. So number one is you have to affirm that perfection is something you might seek to be as perfect as you possibly can. But the great news for a Christian is you've been freed by Christ from thinking you're going to bring about the perfection of the world or your children even or your spouse. All you can do is your best. Now, you can hear that and think, okay, well, I don't have to do anything, That's not, of course, what we're called to, right? We're called instead to love the other person and share our goods with them. And it's by sharing our goods with them, we're kind of pulling each other, hopefully, forward. But when we fail, which is very common, we're freed from the sense of thinking, somehow I've let everybody down. I haven't. This is the way the world is. This is the way I am as a human being. Augustine's great on this, both in the Confessions, of course, in describing his own and his friends' travails as they try to become Christian, as they try to grow towards Christ. But also in the City of God, he reminds us politically and otherwise that you could see in the world the fallenness of different political communities, but we Christians, again, we have a clarity about this that non-Christians don't have, where we can see through it and we can see God's activity in even a place like Washington, D.C. or the United States of America. Look, it's got warts, but it's also a beautiful place. It's a wonderful place. And if you have the right sensibility, the Christian sensibility about what God has given you, you'll recognize this is a gift, right? Even in its imperfection, it's still a gift. It's a great gift. It's the sort of thing that you can rear your children, in. You can plan generationally in terms of, the sorts of people you bring into the world. Look at Ave Maria itself, right? The existence of this university, a person's dream about bringing about a place. This is made possible by a kind of wonderful country that is nonetheless imperfect, that is nonetheless mortal, right? That is not the kingdom itself. These are all Christian insights that free us from mistaken assumptions and then bad activity based on those assumptions.
Now, there's a great, I did an episode on this podcast on a book with Scott Hahn called Catholics in Exile, and he goes through at length Jeremiah 29.
Yeah, Jeremiah is an important book for this.
And it's a story when Israel is in Babylon, and the question is, it's in exile. How should Israel, or how should Judah live? And it basically says, while you're there, I know the plans that I have for you. I will eventually bring good. And for right now, you need to build homes, and you need to have your children marry and have your children's children marry.
Right.
You're in Babylon. Make peace with the exile you're in.
That's right.
Don't make it your home, but be kind of at home in it.
That's right.
And I think it's just a beautiful image. And, your exile will be long. Build houses, live in them, plant gardens, eat their produce. And this seems to me this has to be our attitude. It's still Babylon. Don't kid yourself.
That's right.
They're often idolatrous and they're often murderous, but we're there. So now we're going to find what's the good that we can achieve here. Well, the good is maybe we can plant some gardens. Maybe we can have some families. Maybe we can read some books. We can teach. We can study. We can learn. Maybe we're going to have to help build the walls of Babylon when they fall down.
Right.
Perhaps even when Assyria comes, we might have to fight the Assyrians. There's just there's this element. And, one of the things that you discuss, and I just wanted to add, because I was listening to some of the other things you've spoken about on this, and there's a lot to be said about this, but, I think it's Francisco de Vitoria.
Yeah.
Who is a 16th century Spaniard theologian. And as the Spanish are somewhat, kind of expanding into the New World and encountering native peoples and sometimes evangelizing them, other times also exploiting them, what's going on, they're arguing about this. And they're trying to argue about, wait a second, the native peoples we're encountering have rights, that they own their property.
Right.
These sorts of different elements of trying to negotiate these things. So that whole question is huge, right? But the one thing that you spoke about that I thought was really fascinating was that you were trying to talk about how that as Vittoria develops the just war teaching from Augustine and Aquinas, that he begins to, as he's applying it to, again, and this is where we're dealing just always with actual events. Other people are doing stuff. We're now trying to evaluate our response.
Correct. That's right.
We never get to start from scratch. But you say that both sides can have reasons for their actions. Both sides, in a way, are rational.
Yes.
While only one side only one side may be just.
Correct.
And I thought this was a really powerful insight that other people may have reasons, other agents, even bad agents may have reasons, right?
Absolutely.
To which they can appeal.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, only one can be just. So could you kind of unpack that a little bit from Vittoria? What does he say? And then how do you see that as indicative?
You talked earlier about mercy and forgiveness, right? And how Christianity, it's different in part because of mercy, grace, and forgiveness. And actually, this is a point that the Jewish political philosopher Hannah Arendt makes in her book, The Human Condition. She talks about Jesus introduces into politics the principle of forgiveness, right? So Vittoria, to some extent, is bringing those concepts into political analysis. And part of what he is getting at there is this insight, which is not, you don't have to think very long, which is both sides often enter into conflict thinking they're in the right. Correct? And this happens when you're arguing with your neighbor about the tree, right, that is hanging over somebody's fence, right? You both think you're in the right, and typically you both have a kind of plausible claim as to who in fact is right. But only one of you turns out to be right. And whether it's the state coming in or the city coming in and saying, no, in fact, Dauphinais, your neighbor is in the right here, and you're going to have to cut those branches down or whatever, or repair his fence and so on. Whether it's a state making that judgment or morality itself, right? Only one of you, in fact, is in the right. But the plausibility, the reasonability of you thinking incorrectly you're right, or me thinking incorrectly I'm right, or a state incorrectly thinking it's in the right, ought to chasten us in terms of how we respond to them. So what Vittoria says is that the authority that is authorizing an in fact just clause, not thinking he's right but being wrong, but in fact just cause, objectively just cause, has to factor in the other side has plausible claims here. And in factoring that in, he sets the conditions for a more stable peace by being more forgiving, by being more permissive in terms of, okay, look, we're not going to exact everything out of justice that we might be able to because you started the conflict or because you provoked us into the conflict or whatever. We're going instead to try to bring about a more peaceable situation. So we don't do this again, recognizing, yeah, you did in fact have reasonable claims, even though they're in fact wrong by law, morality, both, and so on, right? That's, to me, the brilliance of that idea. And it also, as somebody who thinks about war a lot and you're aware of, like, there's political realism, to me this is a very realist principle, right? Anytime you're trying to think about the morality of a conflict, even like a conflict that hasn't yet risen to war, right? It might just be economic sanctions are being leveled against, each other or so on. It's always good to think, well, why do they think they're right? What are their interests here as they are provoking us into a conflict? And that will help you provide not merely a measured response, but in fact, the more effective response to the situation. And that's good realism.
Yeah. So would you, it seems, and I'm sure there are others you may know, but maybe like World War I seems to me to be kind of the Versailles Treaty, where England and France exacted a tremendous amount of payment from the Germans,
which the English and the French acknowledged afterwards. Right? Geez, we kind of humiliated them, right?
Yeah, and by doing so, kind of like, and then you combine that with the ongoing depressions, et cetera, that you somewhat perhaps set up Germany not with the respect to were there any reasons with which that the World War I that Germany went to war, stayed in war, and then how do we, even if we see them as wrong and illegitimate,
correct,
and therefore that like we will, but we can take those into account. What are there instances where you think that has been done in a way maybe that is more effective, and therefore the peace was more lasting? Yeah,
that's a great question. Well, certainly after the Second World War, right, there was attentiveness to the fact that the post-First World War conditions had set up an environment that was humiliating to different populations, right? And you have to do your best not to humiliate them, because it provokes a kind of long-standing resentment. And if part of the challenge with the Just War account is it's nation-state based now. Right. And because it's nation state based now, it wasn't always this way. This is the great thing about being Catholic is our tradition and our concepts span many different historical periods in terms of the way politics are defined and so on. But because it's state based now, you have the problem of pockets of nationals, people who speak a language of another state in these funky defined borders, whether it's Poles in different.
And so is after World War I, right?
After World War I, you had a lot of this with
and
the
a lot of it wasn't a lot of. I mean, relatively speaking, right? The English and others redrafted certain.
Right, and the Middle East is a good example of this, where the lines that were drawn in terms of states don't make sense of the experiences of the local populations, the language, and
so again, that sense of which this is radically imperfect and messy, and you can't.
It's radically imperfect,
and you're not going to.
And one of the failures in many of these situations is that it's to go back to the Vittoria example. It's the powers that are making judgments about native populations that confound the native populations and imposes on them juridical lines and laws that becomes very difficult for those populations to like live within. And so you set up situations of ongoing conflict. This is true, in Eastern Europe. It's this is humanity, right? Human beings making these kinds of judgments. Anyway, so part of what Vittoria is getting at, and I think, again, what is good about our tradition of thinking about these questions is, you see it in Augustine already, which is this can't be about hate. It can't be driven by tribalism, right? Tribalism and things like that have been destroyed by our gospel, right? Neither Jew nor Greek, right? Those things that seem so relevant to all of us. And you can't think of more relevant categories for people at the time of the early Christians than Jew and Greek, right? That's no longer relevant. God calls everybody irrespective of this. And our politics, to some extent, has to recognize the relativity of these distinctions. They matter in some ways, for sure. All of us are proud of our backgrounds and so on, and we should be. On the other hand, they're not boundaries that cannot be crossed by love, right? And that's something we haven't talked about at all, which is just charity and how charity operates in this context too. And we're supposed to continue to bring charity even into these very difficult situations where, you're bringing force against other people or making hard judgments against them.
Yeah. So, and I think it's interesting that you can take that idea that you raised there and kind of think of it even like conflicts within family members. You might be right, but your teenager might have a point.
Absolutely.
And so if you want your peace to be absorbed, you better find out what your teenager is thinking. Right? You can win today through power, but if you want to win your teenager over, again, if you're arguing with somebody on politics or something, at least try to understand, what are they thinking?
That's right.
And is there any way that your answer can at least accommodate that? So I think it's really a power play.
Sometimes it can't, and sometimes it can't. Yeah. But again, these are important distinctions that have to be made. And sometimes as a parent, it's the authority, right, of being the parent that permits me to make a judgment, and later I go back to it like you suggested and say, listen, I get your perspective. I understand it. And hopefully in the future, we can figure out a way not to find ourselves back in this situation again, but you have to recognize I'm the father here.
And that idea that even unjust agents, bad actors, are still acting and leading often from some claim to being reasonable.
Right.
And therefore, the more we understand that rationality that is somewhat behind motivation, even if clouded,
that's right.
That is going to help us find a more mature peace. And so I think it's an interesting way of thinking about how the gospel of mercy and forgiveness can actually enter into. So we're always looking in a way for the most peaceful resolution.
That's exactly the way to put it. This is all about. It's all about peace, and it's a peace that's achievable in this world. That's right.
So another thing I think that's just helpful when we think about just war and everything, because I think sometimes people think kind of like, oh my gosh, this is so complicated. What are we going to do? And I think there's a way in which, obviously, it's important. The Catechism talks about just war. It gives some elements.
Yes.
It talks about who can do it. You need to be the person. I don't get to decide whether or not the war is just, kind of.
Correct.
In some ways, I don't get to go to war. You have to be the person who's supposed to do it and those sorts of things. People are interested. You can read the whole section on safeguarding peace, avoiding war in 2302 up to 2317. But I also think there's an element that, to a certain extent, the more we focus on this, what we're supposed to do is recognize the radical imperfectibility of the city of man.
Yeah.
The imperfectibility of our families, the imperfectibility of our societies, and not throw up our hands in frustration, but throw up our hands in worship, right? Which is that God and God alone, heaven and heaven alone can satisfy that desire we have for peace. Not an earthly utopia, but the heavenly utopia that Christ is.
Right.
So could you say just a little bit about how that's important to remember in the midst of these conversations about, war and peace?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think anytime you're counseling against perfection, I think it's good. Like we talked about before, because you're resisting a temptation to expect more from your own activity, from the world, and from your capacity to control it than in fact we have. And if you think just about yourself, forget about the peace within a family. How about the peace within your soul, right? Which we all struggle with. And you can look at the failure of ourselves to find peace and despair, but our faith is so good in pulling you out of that by saying you've been, again, released from having responsibility for that. God is giving you a gift. All you have to do is make yourself available to receive it, and it will be yours, right? And this is what, again, Augustine does such a brilliant job of teaching us. And just that fact that I am now, again, freed from thinking I'm the agent of my own salvation, right, licenses me to engage the world in a much better way. I can make good of the peace, the imperfect peace I have now, and live in hope, like you quoted Pope Benedict before, that the peace that I really want has already been presented to us all, has been guaranteed to us all by Christ's saving activity. That does operate in, that's the background of the Catholic just war approach, that we're not going to bring about the kingdom by our activity, but we care about the peace of the city we find ourselves in, and we care about it in a way, again, our neighbor citizens don't understand, but we can be wonderful citizens because of that. We can be, in fact, of course, the best citizens because we understand this better than they do.
That's right. Well, we are coming up kind of towards the end of our podcast, and this is really helpful to think through. And I appreciate kind of stepping back and looking at the big picture and not just kind of I think sometimes these discussions just get how close to a city can you bomb? Or, these sorts of, and I don't want to make light of those questions, but I think it's these are the bigger questions that we need to ask. And this idea that we, that we somehow have to be able to say that God's providence is, I'm willing to say yes to God's providence, even though it is, in a certain sense, hidden through the distressing disguise of poverty and violence. And that I trust God will bring good out of this order, and that I can participate in this order, and not without my need for, God's mercy, but that I can do good. And I feel and that people can, even using violence, this idea that the commandment is not thou shalt not kill properly. It's really thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not take innocent life. So that's really helpful. I want to kind of just ask you maybe three final questions.
Sure.
And so what's a book you've been reading
recently about war, or just
anything you want? Just these are questions I like to ask all my guests. Just what's a book you've been
So I'm reading Buddenbrooks. Do you know Buddenbrooks by Thomas Mann?
No.
It's about a family and the decline of a family. It's really a brilliant novel of a German author.
Yeah.
If you've ever
when is he writing, Thomas Mann?
I think it's late 1800s.
Okay,
I wish I knew all
kind of those great great years of the novelist.
Yeah, and
Okay.
if you've ever read The Leopard by
I have not.
it's an Italian author,
Okay.
and there's a famous movie you should watch by that stars Burt Lancaster
Okay.
playing an Italian count. They're very similar stories, and a kind of a decline of a semi-aristocratic. In The Leopard, it's aristocratic family over time as the generations kind of unwind, and so that's a book I've read before, and I was reading it on the plane down here, and which I love. It's a great book.
That's great. What's a spiritual practice you do on a regular basis to find greater meaning and purpose and maybe recover that hope in heaven?
Yeah, that's a good question. I always feel like I'm not good enough with these things, but what I do whenever I go to work is I spend time in the chapel before the workday starts, and I just sit in there and pray. Sometimes the rosary, sometimes just thinking out loud with God. What I'm here for and what I'm trying to do for my school and my university that can serve the church better. So it's that quiet time. This is Caldwell Chapel on Catholic University's campus, which is a gorgeous chapel. And there's almost never anybody there at that time of day.
Yeah.
I typically arrive around 7:30 and just spend time in there, just trying to get myself right.
That's beautiful. What's a belief you held about God that you discovered was false? And what was the truth you discovered?
I guess the personal nature of God, because my recovery was intellectual, as you identified earlier. It was a kind of I'm thinking about questions and so on, and that can be somewhat abstract. And you can think of God then in terms of nous and wisdom and things like that. But to be reminded that God is personally engaged with us has been something that took longer, and that was a correction for sure. And it still kind of stuns me in a way that our God is personal and really has a kind of intimate relationship with us that we seek by analogy with each other.
That's beautiful. Well, thank you so much for being on the show again. This has been Dr. Joe Capizzi, Dean and Ordinary Professor of Moral Theology and Ethics at the Catholic University of America. You've been teaching and speaking on moral theology and, just war and other issues for many years. And just very grateful for all your work and helping to really kind of remember and pass on this great tradition of thought so that we can really kind of face these questions that dominate in many ways, at least certainly our political landscape.
Right.
With a certain sense that, hey, this too can be, even though it's messy and complicated, it can be understood.
Yes.
In some sense, we can make some distinctions still between just and unjust.
Have to make
right? Even if a lot of people have reasons, not all reasons are good.
That's right.
And so we can still seek for the just cause, the just war, the just life, and yet also still kind of like somehow, I don't know how to put it, like recognize that not fall for kind of the false promises of these totalitarian ideologies that somehow promise a final, like a solution to earthly life. And I think that's kind of the beauty of the Christian answer is it doesn't really offer a solution. It offers a path. And so I really appreciate all you're doing.
Michael, my pleasure. This is a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
That's great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to the Catholic Theology Show. Thanks, and God bless.